In this video, we're going to be covering the topic of sockets. Sockets are actually used to create a connection among the computers. So we have already discussed the introduction of sockets in the previous video. Now we're going to be using sockets practically in this video. So let's get started. To use a socket, I'm going to create another package to manage my hierarchy of application. So I'm going to create a package with the name of communication or COM. I'm just going to create new class and package. I'm going to use com.beda.androidchatter.com. COM would be actually standing for communication. So socket is actually for communication. We are actually give it the name of COM. I'm going to click on finish. And that's what we have is actually a communication package. Now I'm going to create a class inside this. And I'm going to create and give it a name of socketer, and I'm just going to finish it, and that's it. Now we have a socketer class. Now that after I've created the class socketer, I'm going to implement the socket class from the package interfacer, because socket contains the variables which we're going to be using inside the socketer class. So I'm going to implement the interface implements and that will be containing socket, and I'm just going to use it. Now as you can see that Android chatter interface socket, and then I'm going to add the unimplemented methods in here. So I've created actually these methods like send HTTP request and start listening port methods inside a socket file. I'm gonna finish it. That's it. Now we have these two unimplemented methods. I'm just going to press the enter key, and then I'm going to create a server authentication variable, string variable, which is going to be holding the server authentication, which means that the port number and plus the IP address, so that we're going to be able to use that in our upcoming connection. So I'm going to use private static final string authentication server address is equal to, and I'm going to use HTTP 127.0.1/Android chatter. So now you might be confused that what this address is and what does it belongs to. If you are familiar with the web technologies and web servers, then you will definitely get the point that what I mean to say is that it is actually pointing out to the web server address where I have placed the Android chatter folder, and inside the Android chatter folder I have created a database and plus a little bit of PHP coding. We're going to be also discussing that part but in later videos. So for a demo purpose I have just placed this kind of URL in here, and then after we have complete the PHP code, then you will begin to understand that why I place this code in here. This code is actually used to make a connection with the web server address, and with that web connection we're going to be able to connect to different users. So I'm going to press colon and press enter. Now I've written some variables in here, and let me discuss it one by one. This is actually pointing out to the listening port. For example, it is actually the web server port 127.0.01 port, which we are going to be working out that. So that is actually a listening port. By default I've just placed it 0, and then we're going to change it. And now the next thing is that we have HTTP request failed. This string I've put this string in here so that if any thing happens like a connection failed happen, or if we are requesting for the HTTP request and it fails, then this string will be activated, but by default I've given the value a null to it. And the next thing I've used is actually a map, a hash map. A hash map is actually an implementation of the map, and a map is actually a data structure consists of a set of keys and values in which each key is mapped to a single value. A maps provide a helper keys to iterate to all the keys contained in it. So it contains the init address, the initial address, which is going to be launching from that, and a socket for the connection, and then we give it the name of sockets, and then we actually instantiated it. The next thing we used is a server socket. As I've told you in the previous video, the server socket is used to hold on a port number. So at the start we have just given it a value of null, and then we're going to manipulate this value. And then I create a boolean value of listening, so that it will be providing us in the information that whether the port is listening or not. Now added another method that is actually a receive connection method, and it is actually a thread method, or a thread class you can call it. It is actually extending a thread, and it is actually a class, not a method. So what does it really do is, now I've added another class that is actually a receive connection class, and it is actually extending a thread. So it is actually a thread class. Inside that class I have created a socket reference with a client socket. The client socket means the connection of another client which would be going to communicate with the server, and I also initially place this value to null. And then I created actually a constructor of that receive connection class, and then provided the required parameters to it, like this.client.socket. And then I provided another thing is that with the help of socketer, which is actually the main class name, I've actually got the values like the initial address, which is actually 127.0.01. So I got this address with the help of get initial address and using the socketer. The next method I have written in here is actually the run method. It is actually the default run method of the thread, as receive connection class extending the thread, so we're going to have to enter a run method so that we're going to be able to execute this thread. And inside this thread I've used a buffer reader. So what does buffer reader do? It's actually reads the input connection, and as you can see that I've just provided the client socket.get input stream. So client socket is actually a socket in here. As you can see that it is actually a socket, and I am just getting the input stream from the socket and using and manipulating it via buffered reader. So for example, if the user is online, so that is actually an input stream, and I am getting it through client socket, which is actually a socket in turn, and then I'm just manipulating it via buffer reader. And then I'm just actually creating an input line string, and then with the help of this input line I'm going to read through the whole input stream of that incoming connection. So if the input line is equal to in.read line is not equal to null. So what does it really mean? That if input line contain the in.read line, which means that in is actually a buffer reader, which is actually going to take out the input. So the input, which means that if the buffer reader is reading the line, each and every line, and then storing it inside the input line, is not equal to null. For example, if there is a string of incoming connection like hello world. So hello world is actually a string of incoming connection. It is coming in, and a buffer reader is actually reading this string of connection and then storing it inside the input line, and is not equal to null. For example, buffer reader is actually listening to h of that hello world, and it is still not equal to null, and it is stored now inside an input line. So now we're gonna manipulate that while that is going to the last word, like the hello world. So D is actually the last word. Until the D word, it will begin to loop down. And then after that I have provided the two if else statements, like if input line, that is actually this one, dot equals exit is equal to false, which means that if the input line equals to exit, which means cross it down or close it down, then return false, which means that it is not going to happen. And if it is not equal to exit, then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to shut down the socket connection, because the thing is that when the input connection closes down the hello world and it's completely read out the hello world, then you don't need to have a connection within that case, so that you're going to have to provide shut down the input plus shut down the output, and then you're going to have to close the client socket, because you're going to not leave it for a write and read operation. And then after that, what you're gonna have to do is, with the help of this line, you would actually remove the socket. And what is socket? I've already discussed it, and the socketer would be actually defining this class. So with the help of this socketer and as well as this context sockets, you would remove the client socket with the help of its initial address. That is actually the address I'm talking about, this one. So this would be actually an initial address. I'm just going to get back. And here I have provided actually a logger, so that if any problem or exception occurs, then it's going to be telling us that what is actually that specific kind of exception. So I provided that receive connection.run when receiving connection. So if any problem appearing while we are connecting and doing socket kind of stuff, then it will be saying that yes, it is actually receiving the connection.